Alright, hey everyone, this is the next tutorial video. This one's going to recap what we're going to be doing in class on Thursday. This will be part 1 of the video. I'll probably do it in a separate video for the second part. Part 1 will be about setting up animations for a pre-made model that we're going to download for free from Unity. So we'll be using a free skeleton model. More specifically, we're going to use one that has animations and prefabs built in already to it. As a reminder, prefabs are pre-made models that already contain a set of components and settings applied to them. So that's going to make it very easy to drag and drop multiple copies of the same model into the scene, and we can then have them all follow the same behavior and scripting, because they're all coming from the same prefab. For this example, we're just going to load one into the scene, but you could easily expand upon this to have multiple skeletons in different areas of the scene. So first, we need to go to assetstore.unity.com. In this case, we can just search for skeleton outlaw, and that's the one we'll be using. You should just get one result for it. It'll probably look a little different because I've already quote-unquote purchased this. It will probably say purchased once you've done it, even though it is free. Don't worry about it. It still considers a free download as the same as a purchase. This area here, for me it says open in Unity. For yours, it would most likely say something like add to my assets. You might have to agree to some terms of service and a couple other pop-ups, but once you do, you should have this button turned into open in Unity. If not, you can refresh the page. Once it's there, you can click it, and it'll prompt you, assuming you're in Google Chrome at least. It'll probably do something similar if you're in a different browser. It will prompt you to open it within Unity. I already have a project set up here. You can either make your own new project for just this, or you can make a new scene in the project1 file. So once that's there, you'll have the package manager pop up, and it automatically shows Skeleton Outlaw. So you can click download in the corner. Mine says re-download because I already have it. And then you can import it. That will give a new pop-up here. Within that new pop-up, you can click all, just to make sure the entire folder and everything within it gets imported, and then click import. Shouldn't take very long. Most likely, you'll get a ton of warnings in the console about animation import warnings. I honestly don't know what they mean. It has something to do with the way the model is rigged and the way the animations are applying to it. I haven't run into issues with it, so I think it's safe to ignore. I'm going to clear them. And so now, in the project view, you'll have a new folder for Kevin Iglesias, who obviously made the model. You can start navigating through that. Once you go a layer or two in, you'll get all these folders. So for now, just go to the prefabs folder. You'll see there's 4 of them in here. It's basically 2 pairs of 2. I don't really know what makes them different. When I looked at them earlier, they seemed identical. I don't really know what makes them separate, but you just click and drag the first one in. Double click it, and see there he is in the scene, doing the default T-pose that most models do. So I'm going to leave him at position 000 by default, but I am going to move the camera, because we're going to be playing the game and we want to be able to see the front of the skeleton. So I'm going to put him, the camera, at 0, 1.5, and 2.5. And then rotation 10, 180, 0. So that makes it a slightly angled down camera from above. You can see it in the camera view here. It's kind of not really angled too much downwards, but close enough. Now if you run the game just as is, you might not expect it to do anything, but what it actually does is it's actually cycling through all the animations that came packaged with it. Including 2 dead animations at the end. Now he's jumping. And now he's gone back to the beginning, the first idle animation. So that's because the way the animator is set up for this particular model, it's already set up to cycle through every animation, just the way it was set up. If we want to actually view that, we go to Window, Animation, and then Animator. By default, it'll show up here. I personally like putting it down in the bottom area more. When you click on the model, you'll see now it's showing the animator settings for that model. You can see there's this whole process down here. Zoom in a bit. If you Alt-click and drag, that will scroll around the area, whereas if you just normally click and drag, it does a selection. But you'll see there's this process here where it says Entry, going to Idle, Idle 1, Idle 2, and it goes through all these different animations as you scroll. And once it's done, it loops back around down to this bottom one here, which is the default state. Which means once the final one is done, it reverts back to whatever the default was. So this is just how it already came packaged. We can edit this, and that's what we're going to do next. What you also notice is the three down here. Any state, entry, and exit. Those three are kind of built-in states that we're not going to be able to modify directly. They all do different things. The entry one is what the model will do by default on load. You can see by default here, this little arrow is pointing towards idle. So once you load the game, it automatically goes to the idle state. The any state is not currently being used, but that allows for you to set up different trigger points, and those triggers can be activated from anywhere in the game, any sort of animation, it will work. So it's kind of a starting off point. The exit one, I'm actually not really sure what it does. I've never used it. I've looked into a little bit of researching on forums for what it does, and it seems kind of complicated from what I've been told. It seems to apply especially when you have multiple animators that are interacting with each other. It seems like there's some sort of inheritance involved that you can do with animations. I wouldn't even know where to begin on that, so if it becomes relevant, I'll look into it, but I don't think it'll be relevant for us. So for now, just follow what I do here. I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to zoom out a bunch. Select all of them and delete them. So we'll be left with just these three here. So what we can do is we can right-click and create a new empty state. I'm going to drag these out of the way here. Now if you click on the new state, you'll see it show up in the inspector. We can rename it. Let's call it idle. So that's going to mean that our default state is going to be the idle animation, just like it was before. Within the settings here, you can select from motions, and when you click the little dot, you'll get a pop-up. If you search for idle, you'll see the three results are the three idle animations that it came with. Doesn't particularly matter which one, I'm going to use idle 0. Now if we run the game again, you'll see all he's going to do now is do the idle animation. You notice it's looping as well. If it doesn't loop, then that is a different kind of step that we need to do here. It should just be by default. If it doesn't loop and you want to make it loop, go back over to the project tab, back out, and get to the animations tab. When you click on each animation, you'll see there's a bunch of settings on the side. If you scroll through them, you should see some of them have loop time with a check mark and some don't. In fact, most of them don't. Where's idle 0? You see idle 0 has a loop time, but you see the other two ones don't. If you actually play the animations, you can see what they look like. Scroll on the preview here. Idle 1 you can see is more of him kind of looking backwards around suddenly, which you could kind of imagine. I mean, I've seen this type of thing happen in games before, where there's this normal animation where he's kind of standing still, and then every couple seconds they kind of look around behind them, and then go back to normal. So that's why it would make sense that the time when he's looking around, you wouldn't want that part to loop necessarily. So I think that's why by default it doesn't. But for this one, we're just going to use idle 0. So make sure it's already looping. It should just by default. If not, you can click it there. Now if we go back over, let's make a couple more states. So let's try and do this in a way that we can tell through scripting when to run, when to walk, and when to die. So that means we need to set up 3 new states. Let's do that first. Make them, we'll rename them in a second. Kind of arrange them like this. Get exit out of the way. Go into each. Let's call the first one walk. Run. And dead. Then you can also go into the motions and do the same for that, just like before. There's only one walk animation, so we can select that there. Same for run, there should only be one. And for dead, I believe there's 2. Yeah, so there's 2, I'm just going to do dead 0. Now these 3 are now set up to do that, but there's no transition point happening. Which means we have no way currently to actually tell the animator to go to any of these 3 states. The way we're going to do that, if you right-click on the any state, you can make transition, and you see you get this little arrow pop out. You can drag. But you notice when you click or hover over onto one of these, you'll see it kind of snaps in place. So if you do that, now we have this little transition point that is attached from any state to walk. You can do the same for the other 2. No, that's still not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. So the next point is, if you click on the actual arrows individually here, ignore the fact that we get a warning for now. That's because we haven't set it up yet. If you notice there's separate settings for the actual transition itself, including a list of conditions, which we have not set up yet. But that's how we're going to do it. We're going to create a couple trigger points that we can then tell for this animation and for this trigger, do this. So to actually set them up, we go to the parameters tab. You see currently list is empty, but if you click plus, you get a couple options here. We're just going to deal with triggers for today. Click trigger, you'll get an option to now name a trigger. Let's call it walk. And do 2 more. Run and a dead. And now when you go back to one of these transition points and click conditions with plus, you'll actually get options to pick from. It lists all of the triggers that we have created, and now we can tell for this particular transition point, when this trigger happens, do it. So in this case, this one is being set for whenever in one of our scripts we tell it to set the trigger walk, it will cause this transition from any state to walk to happen. So that tells it start walking. That doesn't actually move the model, but what it does do is it will set the animation to look like he's walking. So that would go in tangent or alongside with you actually moving the model in the scripting. I'm going to do the same for the other two. Set this one to run, and set this one to dead. Now for now, this is still not going to do anything, because we haven't actually set up anything in the scripting to cause walk, dead, or run to even happen yet. So he's still going to stay idling, but it is set up now. So to do the rest, we need to actually make a script that we can attach to the skeleton, which is a pretty similar process to what we did before already. Click add component, let's do new script, and let's call it something like skelly move, or skelly anim. That will make it. Should just open automatically, I think. If not, you could either go to the project view, or I believe if you double click the name of it, or that there, yeah. Double clicking that is another shortcut for it. So now we have a similar looking thing as we've had before. We're not going to put a whole lot in here for now. What we can do first is we need a reference to the animator, because we need to be able to say animator.setTrigger, because that's the function that will allow us to do that. We can make a public animator, let's call it anim. Now if we go into update, you can see anim dot, and you get all sorts of tooltips for it. If you still don't have the tooltips and recommendations working yet on your IDE, either let me know or just look into it. There's a bunch of things you can do to try to fix it. But the things should still work even without the tooltips. But what we want to do is we can make this probably the simplest setup and just have it be when we press W, he'll walk. When we press R, he'll run. When we press D, he'll die. So we've already done key input, so I don't really have to explain this part too much. So there is a setup for the very first frame of whenever the W key is pressed. This condition will fire off. We can say anim.setTrigger, say walk. So because we set up the trigger that's called walk, this will have that work. If we pass the name of a trigger that we haven't created yet, you'll get an error from the animator then, where it'll say something like, this trigger doesn't exist. Do the same for the other two. Okay. Now if we save the script and toggle back into Unity, it'll recompile. But before we actually run it, we need to actually fill in the reference to the variable here, just like when we had references to the pause text and all those other things in the first project. So you can do this the same way as before. We can click on the circle and select it here. Or another little shortcut, you can actually, since this animator is already on the object, we can click and drag from here onto that. And that's another little way to do it. So now when we run the script, it'll have reference to the animator, and when we say things like set trigger, it'll know what to do. Now if we try it, see by default he goes idle. If we press W, he starts walking. You can see because the walk animation is set to loop by default, you see it's just looping. Tell him to run now with R, he starts running. We can go back to walk, go back and forth. And if we press D, the dead animation, I believe by default, does not loop, so he should just stay down. Which, makes sense. He dies, he's dead. If for whatever reason you maybe want the dead animation to loop back to the idle animation, you can make another transition from dead to idle. You see he stands back up after, and then goes back to the idle state where he just loops that. You could do the same for the others if you want. I think walking and running, it makes sense to kind of leave them as is. For that type of situation, there's probably better ways to do it, so that way you can toggle it on and off, as opposed to just a trigger that's just on forever. We can get into that at a later point, or you can look into it on your own and mess with it more. Same basic concept as this sort of stuff. This is really actually kind of fun to mess with when you get used to it. You can make a really complicated web of very, very intricately intertwined types of state transitions. So you can imagine a scenario maybe where you want the enemy to be checking if its position is close to a player. There are functions for that where you can check the distance between two objects. And maybe the skeleton needs to be, say, 15 units away from the player. And whenever he's within 15 units, you could have it switch to the attack animation. Which makes sense. He's close, he's in range, he starts attacking. Then you could also set the else case to say if he's out of range, set it to the walk animation, so that way he just walks around instead. You can see you would have the same kind of setup here, where you would create some default state where you can transition in and out of, and then all the individual animations, and all the triggers that would actually have them activate. So, we'll be doing this on Thursday, and this video will just accommodate that, so that way if you need to view more instructions after, or if you just want to re-see how I did it. I think this is a lot more of a straightforward way of doing this than me creating slides, because the slides involves having to awkwardly translate these instructions into words, and it's a lot easier to just show it on video.